Hello again, environmental students. We are back for the second semester, and we're going to resume the process we had started earlier this year, where we look at information at home and then we talk about it and use it in school. Chapter 10 is our next chapter. Chapter 10 deals with biodiversity, a word that you have heard earlier this year to a limited degree, but which we will explore in detail in this chapter. So we'll begin, of course, by looking at the definition for biodiversity. What is biodiversity? You can sort of break the word apart, those of you that have gotten to be good at that, to help yourself understand it. Bio, of course, means life. So obviously we're looking at living things, and diversity means differences. So we're looking at differences in life. When we talk about biodiversity, scientifically speaking, we are talking about the number of different species in any area. Now you're going to hear some variations on that in this section and also in some of the things we do in class, but essentially we're looking at the number of different species that you can have in an area. Remember we used population before, sounds almost like population, but that was one species. Here we're talking about any space, like the space of Pittsburgh, the space of Troy Hill, the space of Cranberry, and you take the number of species that can exist in that space. Why do we study biodiversity? Well, it helps us to understand the whole idea of extinction and how real that threat of extinction can be. When we study the numbers of species, remember that's part of the definition, when we study the number of species, when those numbers start to change, then we know that we need to pay attention to what is going on with the life as we know it on our planet. One of the sets of numbers what scientists have come up with at this point is that at this time we know 1.7 million species, but we believe that over 10 million exist. And that's based on all kinds of studies, looking at the fact that maybe if you look at certain areas of the world, particularly the rainforest, where there are, as you know from before, many species there, they haven't studied them all. They're just starting to do that. So this number may change, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, hopefully we'll know more species. But we may be projecting how many exist based on guesses, based on data that we've used from the past to see where species might be found and where new species might be discovered. There are different types of biodiversity. Okay, there's of course species diversity. That's the one to which we've been referring. And when people talk about biodiversity, species diversity is the one that they are most likely referring to. So as we just said a few minutes ago, species diversity is the number of different species in an area. So we're talking about, if you take a certain section, what can you find in that section that's different? However, there are other types of diversities, two others. The one is ecosystem diversity, another word from earlier this year. And an ecosystem diversity defines the variety of habitats, communities, and ecological processes within and between ecosystems. We will look at, and I think we looked at a video today in class where you saw a little bit about this. We'll take a look at this again, but think back to your biomes that you studied earlier this year, and within the biomes, like again, if you look at the tropical rainforest, that there are different habitats. The biome of the rainforest is one itself, and then within that there are different groups. The communities of organisms don't necessarily mingle from one level of the rainforest to the other. So looking at how an ecosystem is different one from another also helps us to understand biodiversity. And then lastly, the third level of biodiversity is considered genetic diversity. Again, we talked about genetics slightly earlier this year when we talked about Darwin and his discoveries in terms of survival of the fittest, as some people call it, adaptation. We talked about the whole process of evolution. But genetic diversity takes a look at the genes within the members of a population. So if you were to study the genes, you might look at eye color, for example, in humans. And not just are there variations of colors like brown eyes, green eyes, blue eyes, but you also have variations of the browns or of the greens. So genetic diversity takes a look at the genes with any population. So 3 different levels of biodiversity as we know it. Well, what are the reasons besides knowing numbers and worrying about patterns of change within the world? Well, we want to know about biodiversity because we know that species, of course, are connected to the ecosystems in which they are. One type of species gets highlighted when we talk about biodiversity, and that's what was called a keystone species. And the keystone species is there not by definition, not because of the fact that it is a certain species, but for the role it plays in the ecosystem in which it exists. So in one ecosystem, you're going to have one keystone species. In a different ecosystem, that same species may be there, but it may not be the keystone species. Keystone, just to talk about that again for another second, keystone is a word you might have heard. We're called the Keystone State, Pennsylvania, called the Keystone State. This goes back to an old architectural idea where the keystone was the stone that held an arch in place. And I'll show you a little bit about that in class. We'll do some sketching on the board and get to take a look at how a keystone works to hold an arch, an architectural arch, together. Without mortar, without cement, but it holds everything together just because of the positioning and the physics that's involved in pushing the weight down on one main stone. Well, keystone species does the same thing. When a keystone species disappears, that ecosystem is threatened. Okay, sorry, continuing again, then looking at why we're talking about the benefits of biodiversity, why study it. It has to do with other species and populations surviving. It has to do with the medical and agricultural and industrial uses that we get from various species. If we lose some species, we might lose some medicine, either from medicine that we know exists now or some medical benefit from the future. So if we don't look at the diverse species within an area, we might be missing out on something, particularly if those species become extinct, if they disappear, and then we're just kind of out of luck because they're gone. And then, of course, there is the whole concept of just being ethically responsible for the world in which we live. And being aware of the diverse species in any space, of course, tells us that we have to know what's going on and be aware of the life around us and protect that life. Aesthetics, if you remember that term, is one of the values from earlier this year. Aesthetics, of course, refers to the beauty of something, the sheer prettiness of it, if you will. And recreation just means using some of the species in a way that does not harm them, but which lends us as humans some free time and enjoyment of free time. So knowing about biodiversity is something that's important for all of these reasons. Okay. We do know that biodiversity is at risk. We know that mass extinctions have taken place 65 millions of years ago. Some of those extinctions were, well, those extinctions at that time were natural. Things like the ice ages came and destroyed species. We know that from studying fossils. If you want to look into that some more, think about archaeology, anthropology as a study that you would consider when you go to college, but you can take a look at some of the extinctions that took place and how we believe those organisms lived and what it was exactly that made them extinct. However, that is not to say that we are not currently looking at extinction taking place. You have heard, I'm sure, the phrase endangered species, species that are likely to become extinct if action is not taken on protecting them immediately. And we know that those species are endangered because of the numbers. So getting back to that whole idea of checking biodiversity, we check the numbers. And when the numbers get low, then we worry about the survival of those species. So when a species becomes endangered, things are done to protect that species, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in this chapter. There's a different category of extinction, and those are threatened species where the numbers are getting smaller and that species will likely become endangered if something isn't done. Endangered is more critical. Threatened is we need to be paying attention to that species. So when we're looking at what's happening currently in the world, we want to look at the current extinctions and talk about things, animals, plants. I always forget those poor plants. But animals and plants where we are worrying about what exactly is going on with their survival as we watch their numbers dwindle. This is a chart, I believe it's in your textbook, which is showing you the numbers of species. And if you look at those green arrows that are pointing down, of course, what you see here is the fact that there are some critical times, things that have happened that have caused sudden drops in populations. And right here, I mean, that's pretty bad right here. Some of these don't look quite as bad, But just one of those drops, of course, signals a huge number. Look at the numbers over here. We're talking about the numbers of, these are just marine families, and how they grow and increase and all of a sudden drop down. And while the drops don't look significant, of course, it means there's no growth. So here, of course, in this time frame, there was growth over geological time, but suddenly there was a decrease, and then it bumped back up. Okay. Getting back to the idea of extinctions, what is it that humans do to the environment that's so harmful that causes extinctions to take place? Well, I believe we referred to this area earlier in the year, and that is the concept of humans taking a habitat and destroying it. Not to say they're destroying it because they want to hurt a species. No, of course not. But the destruction takes place because they're doing things that affect human progress. And what humans do will perhaps build a road or build some set of buildings. And in doing that, they are destroying the habitats of some species, or they're splitting habitats apart. I know you've heard me say this several times. When you look at Route 28, it's a perfect example of a highway that has taken the habitat of the deer that live in that area and split apart the space for the deer, where the deer live, so that when the deer try to just go across their normal habitat, they're crossing a 4-lane highway. And of course that causes problems for the deer, and of course deer get hurt when they're hit by cars and so on. So we split apart their home, and that has caused its own kind of destruction. Another type of extinction that takes place caused by humans is what's called invasive exotic species. Now the word exotic there is one that's not familiar, let me just go back for a second, one that's not going to be found in any particular place. An exotic species isn't native part of a particular region, and it's introduced to a region, and when it's introduced, it causes other organisms to die out. I told you the story before of a friend of mine who lived in Cleveland, lived right on Lake Erie there, lived over an old amusement park that had lots of rats, and they brought the skunks in to take care of the rats. Well, that's fine, but now the skunks have taken over. The rats are gone, but the exotic species there was skunks were just not normally existing in any great number around that area, and suddenly they've invaded and taken over the space and caused the extinction of the rats, what they wanted, but now they have a whole other problem. Okay. The other things that humans do, of course, is to harvest, as in plants. They hunt, they poach, and in doing so, sometimes overdo those things, causing the extinction of certain species. Pollution causes, just organisms that cannot exist with the amount of pollution that humans put into the environment. This particular chart is showing you the species that exist in the world. On the left side, you should recognize some of those names from the information we studied in earlier chapters. This chart's the same as the one that's on page 264 of your textbook, but look at these numbers here. Okay, I have to watch my time, so this is the middle of section 2, but I'm going to kind of go through this. But what you see here is these numbers, okay, the categories that are threatened. Remember we said that means the numbers are going down, and then the numbers that are actually known to be extinct. This is all since the year 1800, because of course that was about the time when scientists started to be more aware of the world and study the species around them and kind of pay more attention to things other than themselves. And then this is a percentage in this column here. Okay, so the numbers of threatened species, the numbers that we know are extinct since 1800. Those are pretty high numbers. Okay, what I think I'm going to do here is before we take a look at the areas of critical biodiversity, I'm going to end this tape now so that I can post this and that you can take notes on this. We're not quite finished with section 2. This is the middle of chapter 10, section 2, and what I will do is I will put section 2 and 3 on the next tape. Thank you for your attention so far. Make sure you're doing the activities that you were assigned in class. See you tomorrow.